How's it going, everyone? It's Harvey from Weather Sponge 5000, and take a look at the latest update of the 7-day graphical tropical weather outlook. We now see that Invest 98L has a high chance of developing, which is what I predicted yesterday, because it seemed like the computer models were very aggressive in terms of intensifying this disturbance as it continues to head further westward, where now we have a 70% chance, and I definitely wouldn't be surprised if we see a hurricane out of this. And unfortunately, this could potentially impact the Caribbean in the more long-term future, depending on which computer model ends up being the correct one, either the GFS model run or the European model. So the Caribbean, you definitely need to pay close attention to this disturbance over the next several days. However, that's not the only thing we're watching. We're also watching, of course, Hurricane Lee, which we've been talking to you guys about over the past several days. And taking a look at the current wind speed of Hurricane Lee, its maximum sustained winds are right around 115 miles per hour, so it's still at major hurricane status, and its central millibar pressure is around 948 millibars, and it's moving west-northwest at around 7 miles per hour, which is relatively slow, but it's expected the speed at which this storm moves is expected to increase once this heads further northward. You also have Hurricane Margaret, but it isn't expected to impact land in the foreseeable future, so we won't be talking about it that much in this video. And we have another disturbance that has a very low chance of developing. So first, before I talk about Invest 98L, or what will likely become Tropical Storm Nigel, we're first going to take a look at Hurricane Lee, which is just north of Puerto Rico at this time, and take a look at the latest water vapor imagery. We are seeing that this storm is beginning to look a little bit more organized as of the more recent frames, where we do see that initially the storm wasn't as circular. We saw that most of the moisture was towards the southeastern portion of this storm, but now we're seeing the moisture spiral around to where it's covering more of the northwestern portion of this storm. And another thing that's good to note as well is that we're seeing the outflow now flow equally on all directions, which shows that it's now over an area where the wind shear is lighter, because we aren't seeing the outflow clouds necessarily drift towards one direction like we were seeing over the past several hours, because primarily since we were seeing strong upper level winds coming from the southwest, most of the clouds were moving towards the northeast. But now we're beginning to see the outflow clouds move a little bit further southward, which shows that the wind shear is certainly winding down as this continues to head further westward, which is certainly not good news, because it'll likely strengthen a bit before it begins to weaken once it encounters stronger wind shear once again, and of course the cooler sea surf temperatures that are a little bit further northward. But it'll still but its wind field will expand, so in terms of just its sheer millibar strength, it likely won't weaken that much even as this heads further northward. Taking a look at the wind shear map right now, and we clearly see that now it's entering an area of lighter wind shear, which is pretty much noticeable just by looking at the water vapor imagery, because like I said, the storm looks more circular today, and we're seeing the outflow clouds move on all directions rather than just one direction towards the northeast. So unfortunately, we're likely going to see a little bit more strengthening, potentially up to category 4 strength, before it slowly begins to weaken as it moves up the East Coast. We do see that further to the northwest of the storm system, the wind shear greatly increases. However, despite the stronger wind shear you see just to the northwest of this storm system, it won't necessarily be enough to completely disintegrate the storm or to have it go through a process where it's going to rapidly weaken, because the direction at which Hurricane Lee moves will move at the same direction as these upper level winds. So the strong upper level winds won't have as much of an effect as, let's say, if Hurricane Lee was moving towards the opposite direction, or another direction that isn't really at the same direction as the upper level winds. So we're likely going to see this not weaken that much despite the strong wind shear, and the instability, baroclinic instability as this moves further northward, will help maintain its strength as well, which is why I'm still concerned for New England and Canada, because even if this were to weaken into a category 1 hurricane, it'll likely be much stronger than what you typically expect for Category 1, because wind field will be a lot higher, since we're going to see baroclinic instability have more of an influence of the storm as it heads further northward. So you would experience far more impacts than what you'd expect for a Category 1 hurricane. Taking the latest run of the GFS model for today, we have seen that the uncertainty has risen just a little bit between the two computer models, where now they're showing a fairly similar trajectory for now. And now we're beginning to approach that time period where the certainty will significantly rise, exponentially rise over the next few days. So potentially as early as tomorrow or Wednesday, we will have at least a pretty good idea of where this storm will go. However, for right now, unfortunately, there's still uncertainty, mainly for New England. For the Atlantic coast of Canada, I do believe that impacts at this point are likely. It seems like this ridge is going to be too strong for this have an open area to where it could somehow avoid the Atlantic coast of Canada. So unfortunately, in those areas, you need to start preparing for potentially tropical storm force or hurricane conditions anywhere between Nova Scotia and even as far east as Newfoundland. You definitely need to prepare for impact, since it's unlikely this ridge is going to be weak enough to where it could avoid you guys. But in terms of New England, there's still uncertainty with the forecast. Now, the GFS model is going back to expecting that this first trough will be a little bit stronger than it anticipated yesterday and will exit a little bit slower than yesterday, which is the reason why that, at least compared to yesterday, the GFS model isn't bringing this storm as far to the west, which will certainly be good news for much of New England. But the center of circulation still comes uncomfortably close to the coast of Maine, where a landfall is easily possible for the coast of Maine. And I definitely wouldn't rule out a landfall even as far west as Massachusetts, and even a small portion of Rhode Island is now under the cone of uncertainty. So in those areas, don't rule out direct impacts just yet, because depending on how strong this trough is and how quickly it exits, and also the second trough will play a role in how strong this ridge is, that'll determine if you're going to experience direct impacts or not. It's still a little bit more uncertain. It's still a little too uncertain to say, but I will say that for now, the certainty has risen in the fact that I don't expect this to take a crazy left hook, let's say, towards Long Island or Connecticut or New Jersey, as I do believe that there will at least be just enough troughing and not enough of a strong ridge to where it'll take a huge left hook. However, it could take just enough of a left hook to where it could make landfall right around Massachusetts, maybe as far west as Rhode Island. That's certainly still a possibility. But this trough, how quickly it exits and how quickly this trough moves will be key, because the more quickly it exits, the more likely we're going to see stronger ridging. So this would move further westward, and if this were to move a little bit slower, and if this were a little weaker, then we would see a track that's even further westward to where Massachusetts and Rhode Island will get involved. So these two troughs, it's still uncertain how strong and how quickly they'll move, unfortunately. We won't really get a confident forecast, I'll say, until the Wednesday time frame. Both of the computer models are still showing different scenarios. If we were to compare this model run to the European model, the European model interestingly does expect that at least this first trough will weaken a lot faster than what the GFS model is forecasting, and will exit rather quickly for this ridge to build. However, we do see that this second trough moves a little bit faster. So while the European model does bring it a little bit further westward, it doesn't bring it as far west, because we see that this second trough, it moves a little bit faster, weakens this ridge just enough to a point where it'll have somewhat of an open area to where the wind direction will shift a little bit more from a southerly direction rather than a southwesterly or a southeasterly direction that would steer this to the coast. This trough is pretty much a saving grace that's keeping it from making landfall in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So there's still uncertainty regarding the speed and the strength of these two troughs, but I'll keep you guys updated. But I will say that Atlantic Canada, likely the Nova Scotia area, you will experience direct impacts. Make sure to prepare, and potentially Maine could be in for impacts as well, but still wait a couple more hours. Wait, I'll say until Wednesday before we get a really confident idea of where this storm system will go. But let's say if the European model and the GFS model were correct, where it'll say just off the coast but hug the coast enough to where New England would experience impacts. And Boston, you should expect an enhanced amount of rainfall. I'll say wind gusts potentially up to 40 miles per hour. It'll be similar to a nor'easter, which wouldn't be certainly as significant as a hurricane, but still could bring coastal flooding in localized areas of Massachusetts if this were to stay just off the coast. But of course, if we were to see a landfall, this would bring hurricane-like impacts, which would be much more significant than your typical nor'easter. So still pay close attention to this all along the New England coast for any updates. But but I'll say that the further east you go along New England, such as the eastern tip of Maine, that's where you at least will have a higher chance of a landfall. There's still a chance in Massachusetts, but just not as high as, let's say, for Maine at this point. When it comes to the strength of this storm system, it certainly will weaken as it continues to head further northward, because we're going to see the wind shear greatly increase as a result of this trough moving through. So we're going to see this storm weaken. Of course, the sea surface temperatures will cool down. Dry air will begin to infiltrate this storm thanks to this mid-latitude cyclone moving through, which will bring the cooler, more stable air around the center of circulation. But that will only, unfortunately, help maintain the storm strength, because that'll enhance the instability for the wind field and the wind speed to at least for at least the wind field to expand and the wind speed to remain relatively the same despite the cooler sea surface temperatures further northward. So although it'll likely if this were to directly impact the coast of Massachusetts or New England in general, it'll likely be a category 1 to maybe a high-end tropical storm, but the impacts will be much higher than your typical category 1 hurricane, because like I said, the wind field will be much larger compared to your regular category 1 hurricane, which means that you would experience more prolonged impacts with a larger wind field, as well as the fact that a larger wind field typically means that the storm surge is a lot higher, since there's a larger fetch where the wind could pretty much pick up a lot of that Atlantic Ocean water over a much larger area to pile up those waves and enhance the storm surge threat along the coast. So impacts would feel a lot more like a category 2 or maybe even major hurricane, thanks to how large this wind field will be. So don't underestimate this storm just because it may be a category 1 hurricane, because this will still be a powerful storm, whoever this directly impacts. Here's a current look at the ensemble members from both the GFS and the European model, and most of them do take a landfall somewhere in between Nova Scotia and the coast of Maine. Still, most of them offshore of New England, but don't be surprised if we continue to see shifts with the ensemble member forecast. Don't make your forecast cone just based on the ensemble members, because they could shift quite a bit over the next few days as well, despite the amount of different scenarios we're seeing from the ensemble members. So definitely still take the ensemble members with a grain of salt, but I do believe a landfall would be most likely in Atlantic Canada and potentially the coast of Maine, with the possibility still existing for Massachusetts as well. And here's the National Hurricane Center's latest forecast cone for Hurricane Lee, and we do see that this is now it's including the southeastern portion of Massachusetts, and even Boston is involved, and there's a large area where the center of circulation could move, which is the reason why that that New England might be spared from even experiencing any minor impacts if this were to take a track further eastward. But you could potentially at the same time experience catastrophic impacts if this were to take the westward track. Point is, the cone of uncertainty is very large, so it's too early to hone in what impacts they're going to experience along New England, but at the very least expect a high wave and potentially storm surge threat along the coast, even if this were hundreds of miles off the coast, since it's still going to be a powerful hurricane and bring large waves. That's at the very least what you could expect. But of course, the impacts could be much more significant with heavier rainfall and gusty winds. So definitely stay tuned for more updates when we get more confidence with the forecast. Now, shifting our forecast to Invest 98L, and the reason why this could be a concern in the more long-term future is taking a look at the GFS model, because as soon as Sunday, the GFS model wants to develop a pretty powerful hurricane and even gets this down to major hurricane status, and it's coming uncomfortably close to the Caribbean islands, where even the Lesser Antilles are experiencing heavier rainfall, as well as Puerto Rico, the extreme northern portions of the Dominican Republic, and it really all depends on this ridge right here. So so definitely pay close attention to the amount of ridging we're gonna see just to the north of it, and also the strength is still uncertain, because if we were to compare this to what the European model is stating, the European model is far less confident that it is going to develop as rapidly into hurricane status. And moving forward with the forecast, we see that the European model really expects the storm to struggle, at least initially, as it expects the moisture to be a little bit too elongated for a close enough center circulation to develop and the wind speed to increase, and too much dry air is entraining the western side. It eventually does organize itself well, but it's far north of the Caribbean, which would certainly be good news, and it's unknown how much ridging we're gonna see. But the European model at this point expects that there's going to be just enough of weakness in ridging between Hurricane Lee and Margaret for this to move northward before this ridge could build. Let me show you guys the 500 millibar height anomaly, and we do see that there is a pretty large weakness in ridging. There is a small upper level low just south of Hurricane Lee, which is allowing the storm to have an open area to leave. But comparing this to what the GFS model is stating at the same time period, you're going to clearly see that the GFS model expects this ridge to be a lot stronger, expects this ridge to overtake this small upper level low just to the south of Hurricane Margaret and Hurricane Lee. So we see a track well further southward. So depending on this ridge, I'll determine if the Caribbean could experience future impacts or not from this storm, and that would certainly be very concerning. And I'll say the further southward this moves, the more likely we're going to experience impacts. So definitely keep that in mind, and more likely this will strengthen potentially into a major hurricane. So in general, the exact impacts you're going to experience in the U.S. are still uncertain, outside of, like I said, the high rip current risk as well as rough surf. But for Atlantic Canada, expect direct impacts. That's what I could say for certain, at least for right now. And for the Caribbean, keep in mind of Hurricane Nigel, where if the GFS model ends up being more correct, that could potentially be concerning. So definitely pay close attention over the next several days, and I'll keep you guys updated. But that's it for now, guys, and thank you guys for watching.